So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Protiviti and Robert Half Collaboration Forum. My name's Paul Middleton, and I'm joined here today by my colleagues from Protiviti and our sister company, Robert Half. This is our weekly collaboration forum, and this is our fifth and final series that will take us to the end of English lockdown on June the 21st, we hope. Since March of last year, our weekly forum has been aiming to invigorate, to challenge and inspire us all to be bold and look beyond our computer screens, to stand up and think differently, as well as to bring optimism in what has been for so many a time of disruption, uncertainty and often change. Over the months, our forum has become a place for today's business leaders and our leaders of tomorrow to talk to each other, learn from each other, challenge each other and gain confidence from each other's perspectives and experiences. And that aim is the same today as it's always been. This is your forum. This is not a closed forum. You're not muted, and it's pretty informal. And I urge you all to get involved and make your voice heard over the course of the next hour. A thread that's run through all of our forums is that now is the time to think differently and to be actioning both big and small ideas. Put differently, we believe at Protiviti and Robert Half that if we don't proactively drive change during this continued period of disruption, we run the risk of rapidly becoming irrelevant and falling behind the pack. But there's another danger now, a danger that's lurking for us all, a tipping point that we are rapidly approaching as we begin to unlock, spend more time face to face with our colleagues and move out of our home office and think about dusting off our office desks. And that is that we sleepwalk back into our old working habits and we leave behind our COVID mindset, a mindset that's given us all newfound ability to drive change at a rate we previously thought impossible, to achieve things that we were told could not be done, and to suddenly be able to overcome barriers that had previously seemed unscalable. In other words, over the last 13 months, we've successfully broken an office-based 9-to-5 working pattern that's been with us since the Industrial Revolution. Our challenge to all of you in this forum is to not march backwards and fall into your old habits and lose everything that you've achieved, because if we do, we can be sure that others won't and will simply fall behind. Instead, let's be bold and imagine what the future can be and how we can grasp it. And that's exactly what we've been doing in this forum and will keep doing. We've already looked at the future of culture, the future of healthcare, the future of success. And in the coming weeks, we'll be looking at the future of work, future of ESG, retail, entertainment, the office and other topics, and digging into how you can shape that future to build on what we've achieved and not sleepwalk back into the past. And today we're looking at the future of inclusion and social justice. If you agree that our future demands us to be different, to think differently, to act differently, we have to ask ourselves, how can we achieve this if we continue to surround ourselves by people who look like us and think like us? How fair and how bold are you truly being in your search and selection of your next employee? How inclusive are your working practices to support people of all different backgrounds? And how practical and considerate is your workplace for everyone? If you haven't got these types of matters right, you're probably missing out on the talent that you need to be successful. But more importantly, you're probably also failing to fulfill an increasing ethical duty we all have as employers to be inclusive and equitable, particularly as we emerge from the disruption of a pandemic. And then it comes full circle. As the extent to which you are being seen to fulfill that ethical duty as an employer becomes increasingly important for your clients, your current employees, your prospective employees, your shareholders, and your future success. So lots to unpack, and you'll be pleased to know we have some experts here today to do it much better than me. And I'm delighted to introduce them all to you. First, I'd like to introduce Robert Nuri from Arctic Shores. Robert is the CEO and co-founder of Arctic Shores, and Arctic Shores is pioneering a new type of digital assessment that uses neuroscience, AI and game technology to match people to roles and careers, allowing companies to transform their talent selection process into being more data-driven, bias-free and diverse. Robert's led the company since 2013, and their technologies now help hundreds of businesses around the world, and we're delighted that he can join us today to share his perspectives. Next, I'd like to welcome back Liz Johnson to our forum. Liz is co-founder and managing director at The Ability People. Liz will be a familiar face and name to many of you, and you will have seen her as a sports commentator and pundit on the BBC and Channel 4. Before her television career, Liz had a tremendously successful swimming career and is one of the select few in British para swimming team to have won gold medals in the Paralympics, World Championships and European Championships. In 2018, Liz set up her company, The Ability People, aimed at recruiting disabled people beside able-bodied people in the workplace to enable disabled people to be equals and to help companies create a true culture of equality. She joined our forum back in July last year, and we're delighted to welcome back today. Next, I'd like to welcome Sally Penny, MBE. Sally is an award-winning practicing barrister at law and non-executive director on a variety of boards, bringing experience and expertise across areas including governance, employment law and cyber security. She's also a member of the House of Commons all-party parliamentary group on work and women. And outside of these roles, she's also a public speaker, broadcaster and diversity leader and patron, as well as a proud mother of 3. Through her work, she gives voice to a wide range of diversity-related initiatives and projects, including through her Talking Law podcast, which has over 64,000 listeners. And she's also the author of several successful books, and we're delighted that she's found the time to join our forum today. And next, I'd like to introduce Shaista Gohir, OBE. Shaista embodies the principles of fairness and equality, justice, accountability and transparency. She is chair of the Muslim Women's Network UK and has grown the network from a handful of volunteers to a national and respected charity with a dedicated helpline for abuse victims that now helps thousands of people. In 2020, she was appointed as the Women's Voice Lead at the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, where she ensures that women's voices are heard and that their experiences are used to strengthen policy and practice and to improve women's health. She's also founded NISA Global Foundation, a not-for-profit grant-giving organisation to empower women and girls in developing countries. And as a women's rights activist and influential campaigner, Shaista writes in her independent capacity and regularly comments in the media, and we're delighted again to have her with us today. So welcome everyone. And Robert, if I may start with you. Robert, do you see UK businesses over the last 12 months responding to the disruption that's occurred by creating a more diverse, a more inclusive and a more equitable workplace? Or rather, have you seen particular groups becoming disenfranchised as the pandemic has progressed? You're on mute, Robert. It was a good start, but
mute now.
There you go.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction, and humbled to be part of such a great group of panelists. And I suppose my one link, because I can't claim anything as much as some of the others have achieved, but is this passion for equality, diversity and inclusion. I think just to, on your very interesting question about how they've responded, well, they've definitely companies have responded. But I don't necessarily think in a sort of joined up and transformational way yet. So one of the first things that I think the pandemic forced is everybody to digitize, companies to digitize their processes. And one of the challenges around that is that what most of them did was just digitize an analog process. So not really addressing some of the inequalities that we had in a way of doing interviews, in a way of doing selection, and just by taking something from the way of doing it face to face and just putting it online, while it may have improved efficiency, hasn't actually, I think, moved the needle in terms of giving more opportunity to everybody. Then I think the interesting thing was that the George Floyd murder in the States is kicking off the social justice movement, has then really pushed actually the focus of companies to look at what they do and how they do it. And a lot of it, I think, to start with, the reaction from companies was just say, oh, well, we have diversity and inclusion policies, and maybe we'll do a little bit of unconscious bias training. But if you just look at the case of like KPMG, I think their chair situation a few weeks ago, a month ago or so, I think companies have been surprised by the extent of disappointment, feeling within staff that a step change needs to be made, and that there's been a bit of a sort of disconnect of senior leaders saying, well, we're doing stuff around diversity and inclusion, and people actually in organizations saying you're not doing anywhere near enough, and there's too much of a sort of talk and not necessarily walking the talk. And so my conclusion on this, and the challenge, I think we've got three challenges from what I see from what companies can do on the recruitment side of things. One is, how do you look through the eyes of candidates? I think people talk about candidate experience, but it'd be great to hear from some of the panelists on here. But actually, how do we really look through all the eyes of the candidates here, not just some of them? And how do we get companies to think about the experience that they are giving people who are applying to jobs for them, and really actually experience it rather than just think about it? I think secondly, companies got to think about how they recognize potential. I think there's a massive gap between the focus at the moment on skills and experience, and that's what gets you a job, rather than have you got the potential to do something, and that we need to break that over-reliance on skill and experience being a qualification for a job, and focus a bit more on people's potential. And third, I think we need to really challenge gut feel in the way that we make the final decisions, and how do we make things more objective. So that's hopefully some three interesting areas for discussion and thought.
Absolutely. No, Robert, thank you very much for that. And we'll come back to those themes very shortly around candidates' potential, gut feel, and so on. Absolutely. Liz, if I may come to you, could you please give us your perspective on how the workplace for those with disabilities or disabled people has changed over the last 12 months?
I think it's a really complex topic because at face value, it's changed for the better, in the sense that now it's a lot more accessible for all, and it's a lot more appreciated how easy it can be to be just as effective in your workforce, but from a different location or working at times that suit you. I think people have developed an empathy for that. I think the flip of it was actually there's a level of frustration that now that it applied to the majority and it was required, it got implemented really quickly, whereas a lot of people with disabilities have been asking for maybe a more adaptable work environment for decades, but there's always been barriers to it, or there's always been a need to submit a reasonable adjustment application for it, when actually it hasn't been. So whilst it's become physically easier to actually operate from wherever you are, and there's more understanding towards that, I think people need to acknowledge the emotional frustration that might have come with that for a lot of people. And now, like I said, a lot of people are a lot more open-minded. They're a lot more aware to what is possible and how fair the system has become when everybody has been asked to work differently. And actually, a lot of people with disabilities got exposed as being more resilient and more motivated and more able to adapt more quickly than those who it was thrust upon, because that's how they live their everyday lives. So in that sense, it's become a good microscopic lens to see what people with disabilities really are capable of. But I think the thing we've got to be very careful of now is, as we transition back to whatever the new normal looks like, that we harbour the lessons that we've learned. We take hold of them, we harness them, and we actually make sure that this wasn't a wasted opportunity, it wasn't a wasted time. And when we learn, we look at the lessons we've learned and we take those to move forward, to ensure that when we return to whatever we're returning to, we ensure that inclusion is at the forefront. And we don't just assume that people with disabilities want to work from home, because actually for some people it has been extremely difficult to be out of routine. And yes, okay, we've had a year to get used to the idea, but a lot of people with a lot of impairments, especially those who don't function neurotypically, they could have decades to get used to it. They'd never get used to it because they cannot. So it's important now that we learn. I think more than anything, we take away from it that it's given us more empathy. We had more empathy. We were able to develop more empathy, but we need to maintain that empathy moving forward.
Thank you, Liz. Again, lots to unpack there, and we'll come back to a number of the themes you've mentioned there in a moment. But Sally, I'd like just to get your opening perspectives as well. We've seen many employers publicly reaffirm their core values and commitments to social justice over the last 12 months. But do you see that their actions have matched their words?
Firstly, thank you for inviting me to this rather esteemed panel, as Robert said. I'm not sure much of what I've got to say will stand by comparison to our brilliant panel. The first thing is yes and no. So I practice in criminal law and employment law, and I act for both sides. So in case anybody holds that against me, I don't think there's anybody on here. But in terms of specifically on the employment side, in relation to your question, yes and no, because for decades, numerous companies have had good policies, good values, and good kind of ethos, really, to embed in the culture of those organizations. And what's happened in the last 12 months is that it's enabled them to go back and have a look. But in other respects, a little bit about what Robert was talking about. They hadn't previously actively engaged in what actually the policies mean. So when one looks at diversity and inclusion policies, they're brilliant. They're brilliant. I've written a lot of them. They're really great policies, but they're not very easy to implement. And the inclusion point that Liz was talking about is a crucial thing. So what actually the last 12 months enabled companies to do is to go, oh, actually, what were those policies like, and how can we actively implement? And one of the things that I've seen is the impact of the death of George Floyd. For the first time, there was an invasion of privacy, if I may say so, in that we were all watching somebody lose their life in our sitting rooms. It wasn't, in a newspaper where you could turn the page, depending on the papers that you read, or indeed on our phones. And so the reasons behind that death all linked in, and that took a lot of companies back to look at actually what was going on social justice and inclusion, and revisiting policies and trying to be adaptable. I mean, there are newer problems and nuances which have arisen, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. But in the main, it's given a kind of stop to look at what's going on, what has been going on, how it can be implemented. So I've seen, certainly in that respect, companies being better, but others not behaving so well. It has given an opportunity, sadly, to deal with, dismissals, for example, and redundancies and poor selection. An opportunity to get rid, if I can use a colloquialism that I'm sure we all understand. I try not to be legal on this forum. That's not why I'm here. But it has caused some of those. And sometimes it can be good reason, but others it hasn't. So I think that what is happening in the main, as I said, is that some have been positive, some not so. But it has caused every company to actually look at those policies. And that's got to be a good thing, because as I say, they can sit there for years. It's a bit like, paternity leave policies. They're not taken because nobody understands how they work. But it's really caused provided an opportunity to revisit some of those.
Absolutely. Sally, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for all the comments so far in the chat as well, responding to some of what Sally, Liz and Robert have said. Well, I'll come back to those in a minute, but I did, Shace, just want to hear from yourself first of all, because for many years you've worked to promote social justice for Muslim women, both in the workplace as well as in wider society, and you've engaged with boards and governments on the topic. How has the pandemic affected workplace opportunities and the fortunes of Muslim women?
Before I can answer that question, I think we need to look at what the baseline is actually. And at the moment, the Fawcett Society are doing a piece of research looking into the career progression of Black, Asian and minority women. And they've set up an advisory board. I'm on that. We had a meeting yesterday. So how they're starting is just looking at what the desktop research says. So, for example, at the moment, what it's telling us is that Black and Asian minority women are getting paid less than white men and also white women, but also they're in the lower paid sectors as well. But those women who are in higher paid sectors are facing lots of barriers. such as not having access to training or opportunities. And yes, there could be unconscious and unconscious bias, or sometimes we're hearing of that, they're giving the difficult tasks to do as well. If you look at the leadership actually data as well across businesses, only I think 1.5% of Black and Asian minority people occupy those leadership positions, but that's mostly men. So actually minority women are quite invisible there. Now that's the backdrop. So now you've got the pandemic. So women are more affected. And then in certain sectors, there will be Black and Asian women that are more affected. And that's because they are working in the hardest hit sectors, hospitality, arts, administration, and so on. Then on top of that, you have to consider caring responsibilities as well. So women are expected to look at the schooling of their children while the schools were shut down. So in my charity, I said to my staff, I'm not expecting you to produce the same output. So against that backdrop, yes, of course, they are going to be more affected. What that means then, really, in summary, is that all those hard-won gains over the last decades of trying to get more equality in the workplace has been reversed, not just in the UK, but across the world. So the challenge really is, what can everybody do, the charitable sector, governments and businesses, to try and ensure that that's stopped, but also help and support women and girls in education and earning their livelihoods and making them sustainable and independent, because poverty affects men and women differently across the world.
Tracy, thank you for that. And yeah, some very eye-opening statistics there. And I think it talks to the theme that, I think Robert started as well around how do we see the potential of people that we want to bring into our organisation, and just picking up on quite a few of the comments in the chat that have been focusing on exactly that. How do you see the potential of someone from a 2-page CV, and how do you not apply your unconscious bias to that? And Robert, I wonder if you may just speak to some of that, because again, from Andrea, from Ashita, from Hayen and others in the chat, that's a comment I think that people are wanting to try and unpack slightly. How do you think we need to truly look at people's potential?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and I can see from the chat there that it's a challenge for a lot of companies, and the answer is actually pretty straightforward, which is you look at their what's called sort of soft skills and their sort of personality strengths. So I think it was interesting what Liz was talking about in terms of resilience as coming out from certain people of how they've coped with working from home and the pandemic. And I think resilience is a really interesting one as what you can bring to a job, particularly depending on how challenging the work is. Things like learning agility. Things like curiosity. So you've got personality traits there that people have got, can bring a lot to the workplace, but they may not even have known that they've got that capability. And so that's where I think we need to look at a different data point and to support what somebody says in terms of an application form. So I think you can do that. You can do it through personality assessments. You can uncover people's potential that way, and you can link that potential to either job fit or cultural fit. But the just one final point on that, I saw one comment on there about blind CVs, and I think the interesting thing about blind CVs is I don't think they achieve what we think that they achieve at all. So all by making a CV blind is you just then push the focus onto their experience and the other things that they put in their CV, which typically are then fueling the sort of unconscious bias focus then, because then you start looking at what hobbies they've done, what football club that they like, or what sport that they do, none of which are necessarily relevant to whether they'll be successful in the job. So I think I'm not a fan of blind CVs, not because that I think that that they're addressing, that we don't need to address unconscious bias. I think the point about the blind CVs is literally just scraping at the surface of what the problem is. And the problem is a CV that is self-reported, provides opportunity for those that have advantage to showcase what they have been given an advantage to achieve. And then the reverse is true. And so actually, I think we're going to do a lot more than just a blind CV. I think we just need to have application forms that are really, really simple, and then give people the opportunity to show what their levels of curiosity are, what their learning agility, what their resilience is like. And there are means of doing that now, and technology can support it.
Thank you, Robert. Liz, just to get your perspective on that, obviously you specialise and work in opening up what's often an able-bodied workplace for those that are disabled. Do you agree with that? How do you get someone's potential to shine through to an employer on a 2-page CV?
Well, I think, yeah, actually, what we come at it very much from the angle of increasing more opportunities or meaningful employment opportunities for those with disabilities. But actually, our focus is on normalising differences within the workplace and genuine, authentic inclusion. And so, actually, like to Robert's point, like there's a lot of truth in that. But also, I think it goes beyond the CV and the application process, because people aren't just diverse to look at; they are diverse in the way that they operate. They are diverse in the way that they can present themselves. And so it's about looking at your entire process and removing all unnecessary barriers and creating opportunity for every individual to present the best version of themselves. And so some might be able to articulate in speaking, some might be able to write a really good CV that sells them, but some also might need to show you what they're capable of by actually participating in a task during the process of selection. And I think actually another point that keeps coming up in the chat is this idea of fear. And I think fear is one of the biggest barriers. People don't want to be pulled up for saying the wrong thing. They don't want to be risk having a case put against them for discrimination or unfair treatment. So I actually think a large amount of the work to be done here is on focus on education of individuals about what difference actually is, what it looks like, what it means, how it operates, and exposing people to differences in a safe and comfortable environment so that they can ask difficult questions. They can, and that's a lot of what we do at TAP, is like help people understand it's not, more often than not, it's not what you've said, but it's how you've said it that causes the problem. And that is true, not of, you don't have to be female for that, or disabled, or of a certain religion or culture. That is true of any human that you interact with. And so it's increasing the exposure and the education to difference so that we can ask questions in a way that they enable people to present their best self, because that's where the unconscious biases come in. That's where your brain short circuits to a gut feeling, but you can't really explain where it's coming from because you don't know how to without being judged. And what we want to do is, when we want to remove judgment from the entire process and the entire experience for everybody, so that you can operate in an equitable way to enable everybody to be successful. So, and that's not to say everyone will be successful, because some people aren't capable for that role that they apply for, right? But then with that, you are actually making sure that you don't need to go on gut feeling, or you don't need to question your gut feeling, because you have chosen the best person on that day for that role. Because I think the other issue is you need to be able to dig deeper and ask questions to get more information out of people. Because if you get a 2-page CV and someone hasn't been to university, well, why haven't they been to university? Like, because the instinct is, oh well, they weren't able to go, or they weren't capable of going. But actually, there's more to that picture. And so it's about making the recruitment process and eventually the selection panel and every stage of it open, so that discussion can happen and we can get as much information as possible. And the reality is, like a CV, a 2-page CV, you can make a 2-page CV say whatever you want it to say if you are good at creative writing. But do you, when you are looking for someone to join your team, do you want the person who is able to write the best CV, or do you actually want the person who's going to make the biggest difference and have the biggest impact within your workforce?
Absolutely. And there's again lots of response and thoughts on that in the chat. And Hester, I'd like to come back to you in a moment on some of the leadership questions you've asked, but just before I do, Shata, I'd like to take a question that Anne's just kind of highlighted in the chat to you as well, which is absolutely agreeing with what Liz has said, but ultimately you represent a group that often those job advertisements, those job opportunities don't even reach sometimes. So what more do companies need to do to reach groups that, you know, for example, that you work with, to make sure that those opportunities are there and open for them?
I think too often you'll see an advert which says we welcome diverse applicants, but then when you read the job description, it kind of excludes you because you think, how on earth would have I got that experience in the first place? So that's the first thing. And also when they're going to, for example, big organizations will go to recruitment firms, are those recruitment firms really looking, you know, far enough in, you know, and they probably also need to be challenged as well. And so for that reason, actually on our website, we've got a free vacancy bulletin board. Anyone can go on there and put adverts on there, and people are starting to use that, you know, for board positions as well as vacancies as well. And I just want to touch on something that Robert was mentioning about potential. I want to give myself a very recent example of something that's happened to me. So I thought with all the experience that I've got, I'd be, you know, well, personally, I thought I'd be a great person on an NHS board somewhere, given that in some parts of the country you've got high ethnic minority population, so you need to understand the patients that you're serving. I've done lots of public patient involvement at the Royal College of Obs and Gynae, which is actually just about general women's health. It's not ethnic minority, but my charitable work is about ethnic minority. So, and if you look at the NHS, 40% of the NHS, the staff are Black, Asian, ethnic minority. And as you get higher up into the leadership decision-making positions, you have less women and even far less ethnic minorities. I thought, well, I want to be in that position. So I started to apply, and I'd see these positions via the Cabinet Office apply. I wouldn't get anywhere because I wouldn't even get an interview. And I think to myself, on these boards, you have an expert on finance, you have an expert on HR, an expert on technology, a clinical technician, a medical expert. Why do we not have an expert on patients? Because just as I am not an expert on audit and risk, these other people can surely not be expert on patients. And then I saw something, and a hospital had advertised an associate non-executive director, which is actually another way of kind of almost mentoring someone through an associate position before then they get into the decision making of a full NED position. And I saw that because depending on what hospital trust it is, it doesn't have to go via the Cabinet Office. It can the hospitals can actually make their own choice, giving them greater flexibility. I managed to get an interview very recently, and guess what? I was successful because the board and the chair of the board exactly took your position, Robert, of what you said, recognised my potential, and the board are willing to, I can't say what it is because it's not announced yet, it will be announced in June, and it will be, you know, a budget of over nearly $1 billion and looking at 2 hospitals, overseeing 2 hospitals. And it's a completely white board. I'll be the only ethnic minority on there. But they're taking a chance on me and willing to mentor me, but they will also learn from me as well. So I think there needs to be across, and this is across, you know, public bodies, charitable sector, businesses, and the government as well, in terms of taking a risk, but it's not really a risk because risk sounds really negative, doesn't it? It's actually recognizing the potential.
Absolutely. Shasta, and Layla, just building on some of that, I know you wanted to come in and just share a perspective on that before we go to Hester.
Yeah, I think, look, there's a number of things I'd say, and I'm watching the comments and the questions avidly in the chat here. For those that don't know, I work at, I'm Robert Half, and my specialism is exec search, so C-suite and leadership positions. I think the last 12 months in particular has done a lot to flush out some of the challenges that we face as recruiters. I think we face them at all levels, but particularly at board level. It's the education on unconscious bias. I'm delighted that most companies now are having education on unconscious bias. It's been well known, and it's part of the training at Robert Half in particular that people recruiting their own image. And we've been taught from an early stage in our career as to how to overcome that and to understand and be aware of it, even if the hiring manager is unaware of it. Education, background, someone mentioned earlier about CVs. When people are reading CVs, even things like having your address on there, the unconscious bias will say someone is from that area. I don't recognise the name as being similar to my own, and therefore I'm rejecting that person because the area that they live in, the address that they have, the name, no, I don't think they're going to fit with our culture. So there is understandably people talking about blind CVs, you can understand that. But to Robert's point earlier, we do now have the technology to start assessing individuals in an equitable manner based on personality traits before anything else. And what that does is personality traits are like EQ or IQ. They don't move. The dial doesn't move as much. We have learned behaviors and coping mechanisms to get over our strengths and weaknesses, but it also gives an insight into future potential and aptitude. So if someone has certain experiences or certain strengths, personality traits, they can be used in the right position and developed. So Shaista, your point, it's excellent, and congratulations on your appointment. Would that have happened 5 years ago? Possibly not. I think there is a much greater awareness now. We have an onus on ourselves as companies and candidates going through a process to educate ourselves. There's a lot of material available, and as a candidate, my advice is to also be aware of what's coming in a hiring process and to have the ability to share some of your personality traits and experiences and tune them to the job.
Thank you, Layla.
So that's what I would say on that. But one other thing I'd just say, look, there's one word in particular that comes up a lot in senior management and executive recruitment, and that is the word gravitas. I'm using this as an example because it is actually known that females will not necessarily apply. We're being asked a lot for female candidates at board level and for non-exec positions. Positive discrimination, some men would argue, but when a female sees the word gravitas in a job description, about 50 to 60% of females will not apply for that job. And yet it is something that is seen and used a lot consistently. So the use of language is also very critical.
Absolutely. Layla, thank you so much for that. I'd like just to kind of begin to focus on some themes around how we can shape the future of workplace inclusion and workplace social justice. I know that Hester, I don't know if you're able to come off mute, but I know you've been asking a couple of questions and giving some perspectives, but I just wanted to dig into the board a little bit and just see, and just wonder if you might just share your perspectives around what you just put in the chat, Hester, and the role of the board. And you're on mute, Hester.
Sure.
There you go.
No. I've come off. I was listening to your full question, Paul. Interestingly, as an organisation, so for those, I work for a company called Lauderventure. We're a very old city organisation. We're a combination of an investment trust and professional services business. And the type of professional services we specialise in are things like corporate trust, pension trustee services. And if you look at the profile of candidates, but in some of those areas, it tends to be what I would describe very much old school city. So typically, for example, our pension trustees have historically tended to be white males in their late 50s who are perhaps coming towards the end of their career as an actuary or an accountant and have now moved to becoming pension trustees on boards, and they're experts in what they do. But then when they start recruiting, what we saw historically was they recruited exactly as we've talked about. They recruited other people who looked like them. And we're very fortunate at Lauderventure that the tone from the top has very much changed. And it's less driven by the board. Our board are obviously very involved and very keen on promoting diversity, but we are lucky enough to benefit from a CEO who comes in with a complete view that that recruitment should be purely done on who's the best candidate, and your name, your background, where you come from doesn't matter at all, because it's all about hiring the right candidate. And there's been a lot of challenge given to our business heads and to our leadership team to say, well, no, just because that person is like you doesn't mean you shouldn't be considering these other candidates. And as a result of that, we've seen diversity over the last 3 years under the stewardship of our CEO increase, and our workforce has gone from being about, and I'm talking sort of ethnic diversity, gender diversity we're pretty good on, was 50-50 split, but in terms of ethnic diversity, we've gone from about 10% to 30% in 3 years. So the journey has very much been there, but it has had to be driven, and that we've had to challenge that unconscious bias. And the other point that I was raising, Paul, is as I look forward, we obviously start looking at having to report on diversity, and the challenge comes around the language and the linguistics we use around that, because it's so sensitive that a lot of people in the chat have been talking about fear. There is a genuine fear that we might put a foot wrong and then we don't represent how our organisation feels about diversity, because for us, we see diversity as a great thing and something that is business enhancing and something we want to continue to embrace. So there is a lot of fear there on that front.
Hester, there's so many themes there to unpack, and I'd like Sally to come back on it. I think Sally's back with us to come back on those in a minute. Just before we do, I mean, it sounds, Hester, as though your company is doing an awful lot in terms of inclusion and social justice, and that's fantastic here. I'd just like to poll other people's thoughts around this as well, and to do that, some of you will be familiar with this. We just have a Menti poll that my team will post in the chat. And if you click into that, you'll go to a screen. This is completely anonymous. It will take you 10 seconds to do. But the question that it will take you to is just for you to give your view as to whether your company, like Hester's, is going the extra mile to make inclusion and social justice a reality. And I'll be interested just to hear your thoughts there, whether you agree, strongly disagree. And once we've got some results there, we come back to that. But Sally, I wonder if you might just come back on some of the points that Hester's made, and also just what you see as the role of the board in driving social justice and inclusion. Sally? You're on mute, Sally.
Hello. Another reason why technology will never replace in-person gatherings. I know we've all embraced it, myself frequently in court, but yeah, my laptop crashed. So yeah, really interesting discussions there. I'm really pleased to hear about Hester's board and what they have been doing, particularly, the figures look good, 10% to 30. That's like a success story, right? And on gender, no surprise, great. We've made a great impact in the main, but we know from what Shaista was telling us about the backward step for women. So what role, the question is, what role do I see the board as playing? A great deal, I'm afraid. I sit on an arts board, which is brilliant. And of course, if you look on my LinkedIn, you'll know which theatre board it is. But just to share a personal story, as Shasta did, I attended a board meeting there. And that was the thing. And I have to tell you, I was dressed smartly. I wasn't in my dog walking coat. There were other factors that you can, and I use humor a lot. But I'd been on that board, for 2 years, so it shouldn't have happened, really, quite frankly. And so the reason it's important is that on a non-exec side, when one looks at the exec team, if that is happening on sort of the board level, what's actually happening in the exec side? And so I asked for some data, I'm quite data-driven, about recruitment and the attraction of people in trying to improve the exec side. And so I think boards have got a role to drive that, and it's good for business. We know all of that. The key question is always implementation, which is where I started when we started on this forum. That's why I'm so pleased to see what Hester's been doing. I think the boards do have a large role, and if we akin it to cybersecurity or some of the other governance issues that we have to deal with, it will drive it. Just a small point, if I may. I don't like the term white males. and white pale male stale, because actually a lot of those are my father's friends and our family friends. I prefer this term wham. It's less offensive. And of course, let's face it, we're all a bit white anyway. We haven't been able to go on holiday anywhere. And wham is a term which is white heterosexual able male. I think it's far better and less offensive than white pale male stale. You didn't say pale male stale, Hester. I appreciate that. But I think when we're talking about language, it's so important. And also language in recruitment is so important. Shasta's right, and so is Layla. This idea of gravitas and the idea of recruiting. We know the stats about qualifications of women applying for a role only if they've got at least 7 out of 10. Men apply when it's 3. It's the same for people applying to be QCs, which is the senior roles for barristers, that women only apply, a few women, when they feel absolutely ready, and yet other colleagues are happy to do so. So I think boards are crucial to some of this. I don't think it needs to be necessarily entry level recruitment. I think we're all doing very well. And if we're honest about it, there is a great deal of recovery to be done post-pandemic. And we need every person, whatever their protected characteristics are, in the workplace in order to get the economy going. And we haven't even touched on Brexit, another factor why we need to build the economy. And so we really do need to sort of stop procrastinating, really, about language and the way that we recruit. Just to deal with the fear question in the chat, if I may, I've got the floor, so perhaps you'll indulge me. I do think that fear is playing a part in people having open and honest conversations, and people in fear of, microaggressions that might occur when one is dealing with ethnicity and so on and so forth. I think one of the easiest ways is to try and get people with characteristics to tell you how the workplace culture can be improved, what can be done. This fear of getting things wrong and therefore being sued and so on and so forth, it's nonsense, because it ends up in too much noise. The fear of not asking, oh, why are you brown? Why is your hair different? I don't know. I'm talking about specifically Black and ethnic minority issues. But the fear in other veins, asking people about non-visible disabilities, for instance. I think open conversations are key. And it's fear, which means they end up in cases, which I end up having to act for companies and individuals. So I do think we need to feel the fear and do it anyway. And I think we need to encourage open conversations, because we're just a little bit lagging. And if COVID isn't anything, we're a little bit kinder, aren't we, as we're told? We're all a little bit more open to ideas and to learning. And so I think that fear is playing a part, but I think there are ways around it. I don't know if I've answered your question adequately.
You absolutely have, and I think not only that, but you've got a lot of people very excited about wham as well, and there's a lot of chat on that. So thank you for that. That's grand. I wonder if my team might just show the results of the poll, and then Liz, I might just come to you on that as well, because I think there we go. So thank you all for doing this. It's always just useful to see a litmus test, and look, I mean, most of you are saying that your companies are going the extra mile to make workplace inclusion and social justice reality, and that's great to see, and that's very encouraging. Liz, I just wonder if you might wish to comment on that, particularly from the perspective of, we might be opening our arms to people to come in who are, let's say, less able-bodied or disabled, or from any other group, but are those workplaces truly adapted towards those people? Are we going the extra mile there to welcome, accommodate, and allow people to be successful?
I think the reality is we base our answers around questions like that on what we can see. And so we judge the visual of what's going on. And there are some demographics that are easier to measure than others just by looking at people. Like, that's a fact. And I also think that one thing we always say is you can't be blamed for not knowing something you've never needed to know before. And so the reality is you're answering that question from your perspective. And I've skewed it as well, because I answered the poll and I said strongly agree, because at within the Ability People, we didn't have diversity on our agenda when we were looking for our team. We had meaningful employment for people with disabilities, and people all united in that overall organizational goal. And as a result, we've ended up with the most diverse team you could possibly have, because I think it's important to note that diversity is a byproduct of authentic inclusion, but you can have diversity without having inclusion, because you can bring people to the table, but unless they are in a position and empowered to enable to use their skill set and their voice and their experiences to contribute to the organizational goal, then you're not necessarily inclusive. And I think that's something that we massively need to be aware of. And so the reality is, I don't think a lot of people, and again, when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about minority demographics, we tend to deal with a demographic at a time or a group at a time. So we talk gender, and actually gender, most organizations are almost there now with gender balance and gender equality. But then we move on to like a culture thing or a sexual orientation element, but diversity is everywhere, and it doesn't just relate to people with who have got a protected characteristic or in a minority demographic. It's, are people single? Are people married? Do people own their home? Do people rent their home? It's everything and everybody. That's what true inclusion and true diversity is all about. And I think Sally made a great point about boards. And actually, what organizations need to understand is that their customer base, regardless of what service they provide, their customer base is ultimately society. Anybody in society has potential to want to buy or use a product, right? That's a fact. And at the moment, if your board does not represent all of those users, and if your workforce does not represent all of those users, then there's no way that you're going to have a product that appeals to all of those users. And so I think when we're talking about boards, we want to get the right people in the right role. And it's okay if you do things differently. It's okay if they are not like you. And I don't mean don't look like you. I mean don't even dress like you, or talk like you, or turn up to a meeting in the same way that you do. Because actually that's true inclusion. If everybody is able to come to a table and engage, that's when you've achieved inclusion. So I think when we look at, and I know we're wrapping up soon, so maybe I'll try and do my wrap up now and you won't have to come back to me, but we need to move away from this idea that we are labeling people, or we are dealing with compartmentalizing and certain groups at certain times. And if we want to be authentically inclusive, then we have to normalize difference. So think about it with glasses, and just ask yourself, like, why is what is about to happening, and how is it relevant to the situation that we are in? And that can be done with, like, that can be around what is someone going to say, what is someone going to do, why am I thinking, what am I thinking? Because if it's not relevant in that moment in time, then don't do it. It's not appropriate, and the chances are your unconscious biases or your previous experiences are influencing your decisions. Because I think we talk about unconscious bias a lot, right? And yes, most people now go through unconscious bias training, but if you sit in a presentation, or you feel like you go through a workbook or a form, and it's do ABC in this situation, or do what, and you'll get 1, 2, 3. That doesn't actually alleviate or get rid of your bias, your unconscious bias. It just helps you deal with certain situations. But what we really want to do when we're thinking about inclusion and diversity and recruitment and the workplace in general, and enabling and allowing people to be themselves, is how do we create an environment where that can best happen? How do we remove all unnecessary barriers? So we always need to focus on the objective, because we've all got bias, right? We're not like, we've all got it. Like, I'm a Liverpool fan, and so I meet a Man United fan, and I instantly have an opinion about. I know, like, it's not that great being a Liverpool fan right now. We had a good year last year. I'll take it. Like, I've had 25 years to practice of being disappointed. But anyway, the point is, like, but some of my best friends are Man United fans, but I still have an instinctive response when I hear that they support Manchester United. And like, but I'm aware of it, and I acknowledge it, and I ensure that it doesn't influence my decisions about them in any other aspect other than they've chosen a poor football team to support. So that's what we need to be aware of, is actually that unconscious bias does exist, biases exist, and actually it's not that sometimes they will never go, but we need to be aware that they and make sure and that they do not influence our decision, because it's not the individual's responsibility to wear that burden of ableism that exists in society.
No, Liz, thank you ever so much for that. And I think Terry's just posted something in the chat as well that's a wonderful conclusion as well, I think, and probably what a lot of people feel. But I would like Sally, Shasta and Robert, just to come to you each just for your closing comments, and just really to get, maybe starting with yourself, Shasta, just what do you feel would be the most impactful thing people can do here to increase their inclusion and social justice in their workplace?
I would say have moral or display moral leadership, which would involve deep listening, which can be done regularly through anonymous surveys, and then challenging themselves, challenging others, partners, if they're clients, and using that financial power, because they can shift the needle far more than an activist like myself can. We talked about boards. You know, we've had Coca-Cola board saying, we're not going to now deal with law firms that have less than 30% women as senior partners. We've had the biggest pension firm in the world, and the pension firms are the most powerful. The Norwegian pension fund, which is £1 trillion pension fund, saying going forward, I think they're going to give it a bit of time. They made an announcement a month or two ago saying that if the boards have less than 30% women, you know, we're not going to invest in them. So I think it's constantly challenging yourself, respect and dignity for all your workers in all their diversity, which will come from deep listening. And finally, having maybe a public manifesto, maybe not to the public, but it could be internal to the workforce, and making bold pledges. So on Vodafone have said on their website, by 2025, we will be the best place for a woman to be working for. And they've got lots of other information on inclusion and diversity.
Shasta, thank you. That's very powerful. Sally, some final thoughts from you, please, before I come to Robert. That mute buttons, there we go.
Hello. Yeah, I don't agree very often, but I find myself agreeing here. So that's got to be a good sign. I do agree with Shasta. For me, the point about internal values is important. Often we find companies are doing some positive things, but they don't tell anybody. And so nobody knows until it all goes wrong. For me, the real pivotal point I have to say is this idea of potential. Have a look at what potentially one can achieve. You know, what can the companies achieve? And it was Robert who used that word potential in respect of CVs and recruitment. But where can we really go? If you take away all the noise and the obvious stuff, you know, what can be achieved? And so I think as one thing people can do, they can reach out to the organizations and ask them, you know, what can we do? What would we got potential to do? You know, I'm just using colloquial terms because I think we all really get it, rather than, you know, something clever and talking about sustainability. I think thinking about potential and reaching out.
Thank you ever so much. Robert, you started us off. You talked about exactly what Sally's just said on potential there. Just your final thoughts, please. And I'm sorry, we are right out of time.
Absolutely. 3 quick thoughts. Love the discussion about language. One of my takeaways is definitely WHAM. I feel happy to be associated with that acronym. I love Liz's point about normalizing difference. I think that's a great way to look at things. And finally, just to end on potential, what I think we can do around potential, and I love Sally's point around that, is think about mentoring, start thinking about feedback. How can we support giving people opportunities and exposure to work and jobs?
Thank you so much. Look, we've run out of time. It's been an amazing session. It feels like we could go on for a very long time with this. I'd really like to thank Robert, Liz, Sally, Shasta, and of course all of you. There's been fantastic engagement, as a lot of you have said in the chat, and that's exactly what this forum's here for. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question, especially with yourself, Terry, but our challenge is to all of you to put in action what you've heard today. There'll be a video of our forum posted on our website. So please share that with your colleagues, your friends, your LinkedIn contacts, and we can continue the discussion. Next week, we'll be continuing this theme and looking at the future of sustainability and ESG, a small topic there just to unpack in an hour again. So until then, until next week, happy Eid to you all. And on behalf of my Protiviti and Robert Half team, I'd like to send our best wishes to you all. Stay safe, be bold, be kind to each other, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you ever so much, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Great
Brilliant.
to see you.
Thanks,
Terry,
Paul.
Solly,
Really
Liz.
enjoyed it.